The smell of pine needles and cinnamon has a way of pulling you backward through time. For me, it always drags me back to the Christmas mornings when my wife Dorothy was still alive, standing in the kitchen in her ridiculous reindeer apron, burning the first batch of cinnamon rolls every single year like it was a tradition rather than an accident. That smell used to mean safety. It used to mean I had somewhere to be. But as I stood on the front porch of my son's house that December evening, shifting my weight from one bad knee to the other, that same smell drifting out from under the door felt like a warning instead of a welcome. I want you to understand something about me before I tell you what happened that night, because I think it matters. I spent 38 years climbing electrical towers for the county power company. I have scars on my hands from live wires that should have killed me twice over. I raised my son, Thomas, alone after Dorothy passed, working double shifts and coming home smelling like ozone and sweat to make sure he had a hot meal and clean clothes for school. I never asked that boy for anything in return except that he grow up to be a decent man. For 30 years, I believed he had. I want you to think about that for a second, because by the end of this story, you might find yourself asking the same question I did that night, standing frozen in my son's dining room. What do you do when the person you sacrificed everything for finally has to choose between you and comfort and chooses comfort? But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the porch. I'd pressed my only good shirt that morning, a soft blue button-down that Dorothy had picked out for me at a department store sale nearly a decade earlier. It didn't fit quite the way it used to. My shoulders had shrunk with age the way an old man's shoulders do, but it was clean, and it was the nicest thing I owned. I'd polished my shoes, too, an old pair of brown loafers I usually only wore to church. I stood there gripping a tin of homemade peanut brittle, the same recipe Dorothy used to make every December, wrapped in a red ribbon I'd tied myself, clumsily, with fingers that don't work quite like they used to. I knocked, and I heard footsteps, and then the door opened, and there was Thomas. He looked good, successful. He was wearing a sweater that probably cost more than my monthly heating bill, and his hair, what he had left of it, was slicked back neatly. But his smile, when it came, arrived a half-second too late, like he'd had to remind himself to produce it. "Dad," he said. "Hey, you made it." "Course I made it," I said, holding up the tin. "Wouldn't miss Christmas with my grandkids for anything." He took the tin from me with 2 fingers, like it might be radioactive, and set it on a side table without opening it. "You didn't have to do that," he said, "which is a strange thing to say to your father who has made you peanut brittle every Christmas of your entire life." I stepped inside, and the house swallowed me whole. It was one of those newer builds, all sharp angles and gray stone and floor-to-ceiling windows, the kind of house that looks like it belongs in a magazine rather than a place where a family actually lives. Everything gleamed. There wasn't a single fingerprint on any surface, which told me either nobody touched anything or somebody was paid quite well to make sure it looked that way. "Hey, let me take your coat, Thomas said, and as he did, I noticed him glance at the collar, worn thin at the edges from years of use, and something crossed his face. I'd seen that look before, at his wedding, at his college graduation, at every single milestone where I showed up looking like exactly what I was, a retired lineman who never had 2 nickels to rub together but always had enough love to go around. That was when I heard her voice. "Thomas, honey, is that your father?" Finally. I was beginning to think we'd need to send a search party out to the bus station. The voice belonged to Patricia, my daughter-in-law Renee's mother. I'd met her exactly twice before that night, once at the wedding and once at a christening I'd been invited to almost as an afterthought. She was sitting in the living room on a cream-colored sectional that looked like it had never once been sat on before that moment, wearing enough jewelry to fund a small country, sipping something amber-colored from a crystal glass. She did not stand up. She looked at me the way you might look at a stain you just noticed on an otherwise clean carpet. "Good evening, Patricia," I said, forcing warmth into my voice that I didn't entirely feel. "Merry Christmas. Thank you for having me." "Oh, we wouldn't dream of leaving you out," she said, and there was something underneath those words, sharp and cold, like a blade wrapped in tissue paper. Thomas insisted. "Of course, family is family," he says, "even when family lives so far away and doesn't call very often." She took a slow sip of her drink. "We were planning something a bit more intimate this year, but here we are. My granddaughter Renee, my son's wife, appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron that looked like it had never actually touched flour. She was polished in that particular way wealthy women manage to be polished, hair perfectly set, nails a shade of red I couldn't have named if you'd paid me. She'd been sweet once, back when Thomas first brought her home, nervous and a little shy around me. That version of her seemed to have gone extinct somewhere along the way. "Mother, please," Renee said, but it wasn't a rebuke. It was the gentle laugh you give when someone tells a mildly off-color joke at a dinner party. "I'm simply saying what everyone's thinking," Patricia said, and shrugged one shoulder, the diamonds on her wrist catching the light. "It's Christmas. Honesty is a gift too." I looked around the room, searching for the two faces I actually wanted to see. My grandchildren. Emma, who was 12 and had my late wife's exact laugh, and little Nathan, 9 years old, who had been calling me every Sunday for the past year to tell me about his science class and his soccer games and, more recently, his fascination with his older cousin's phone. "Where are the kids?" I asked. "Playing upstairs," Thomas said. "Come sit, Dad. Dinner's not for another hour." I chose a hard wooden chair near the corner rather than the pristine sectional. I didn't trust my old work boots, freshly polished as they were, not to somehow track something invisible onto that white expanse of furniture. Patricia watched me settle into the chair, her eyes traveling down to my shoes and back up again, cataloging me the way an appraiser might catalog a piece of furniture being sold for parts. "You know, Walter," she said, using my name like she was testing how it tasted. "My late husband always said that a man's shoes tell you everything about his character. He was in finance, you understand. Very particular about appearances." "I'm a retired lineman, Patricia," I said evenly. "I spent most of my career, 40 feet in the air, in a bucket truck. We didn't get many opportunities to break in dress shoes." End quote. "Well," she said, and smiled a smile with no warmth behind it whatsoever. "Aren't you just precious?" I looked over at Thomas, hoping, the way a drowning man hopes for a rope, that he might say something, anything. Instead, he had his phone out, thumb scrolling, eyes fixed on the screen like it contained the secrets of the universe. He had perfected the art of being present in body only, a skill I imagine he'd developed slowly over years, the way calluses form on a hand that keeps gripping the same rough tool. The conversation drifted, the way conversations do in rooms like that, toward things I had no part of. A ski trip to Aspen, a new boat Patricia's late husband's investments had apparently funded, the renovation of a kitchen that already looked, to my untrained eye, more expensive than every house I'd ever lived in combined. I sat quietly, feeling myself shrink in that hard little chair, feeling like a piece of furniture nobody had quite decided where to put. Eventually, Renee announced dinner, and we all shuffled toward a dining room that could have hosted a wedding reception. The table was long, dark wood polished to a mirror shine, set with more forks than I knew what to do with. And there, at the far end, practically bouncing in his chair, was Nathan. "Grandpa," he shouted the moment he saw me, and his whole face lit up like a Christmas tree, which, given the season, I suppose it more or less was. "You're here. I saved you a seat." My chest ached with something warm for the first time all evening. "Hey there, sport," I said. "How's my favorite scientist?" "Nathan," indoor voice, Patricia said sharply, without even looking at him. "And sit up straight. You're slouching." The seating arrangement, once it was sorted out, put me at the very far end of the table, past the children, past a cousin I'd never met, in what I could only assume was the overflow section reserved for guests who didn't quite count as real family. Nathan, bless him, refused to sit anywhere but beside me, dragging his chair down the length of the table with a scraping sound that made Patricia wince like she'd been struck. "Nathan, honey, come sit closer to Nana," Patricia cooed, patting the seat beside her. "I want to sit with Grandpa," Nathan said, stubborn as his father used to be at that age. He worked on the power lines. He knows how electricity actually works, not just from a book. He climbed poles, dear," Patricia corrected, her smile thin as paper. "There's a difference between doing a thing and understanding a thing. That one landed somewhere deep, though I didn't let it show. I'd spent nearly 4 decades keeping entire neighborhoods lit through ice storms and hurricanes, had trained a dozen younger men how to survive a job that killed careless people every single year, And there I was being told I didn't understand my own life's work by a woman who, as far as I could tell, had never worked a day in hers. Dinner began, and it was, I'll admit, a beautiful spread. Prime rib, scalloped potatoes, some kind of glazed carrots that probably cost more per pound than gasoline. I could hardly taste any of it. The air in that room sat on my chest like a wet coat. Patricia held court the entire meal, discussing her charity gala, her country club's holiday party, the difficulty of finding a reliable housekeeper these days. Every so often her eyes would drift toward me, and she'd find some new small way to remind the table exactly what she thought of my place in it. I do find it remarkable, she said at one point, dabbing at her mouth with a linen napkin, how differently people age depending on their profession. Desk work is so much gentler on the body. And, Walter, dear, did climbing poles, for all those years, do that to your hands? I looked down at my hands, at the thick scarred knuckles, at the finger I'd nearly lost to a live wire in 1994. It did, think, I said simply. But those hands kept the lights on for about 40,000 people during the ice storm of '98. I don't regret a single callus. 1. How noble, she said, in a tone that made the word sound like an insult. Thomas cleared his throat. Throat? Patricia, maybe we could talk about something else. I'm making conversation, Thomas. Honestly, you're all so sensitive. She turned back to me, a shark that had caught a scent. Tell me, Walter, what is it like living on a pension? It must be freeing in a way. No stock portfolio to worry about. No estate planning. Just simplicity. The table went quiet. Emma looked down at her plate. Tight. Even Renee seemed to find something fascinating about her water glass. Thomas, my own son, said nothing, cutting his prime rib into smaller and smaller pieces like the meat had personally wronged him. I get by just fine, Patricia, I said, keeping my voice level though something hot was climbing up the back of my throat. I put my son through college on a lineman's salary, paid off my house free and clear, never took a dime from anybody I didn't earn. A whole house, she said, arching one eyebrow. How charming. I do hope it has proper heating. She laughed, a bright brittle sound with nothing real underneath it. I felt the blood rushing in my ears, but I told myself the same thing I'd been telling myself all evening. Just a few more hours. For Nathan, for Emma, for whatever was left of this family that was worth showing up for. I turned to Nathan instead, needing an escape hatch. So, Sport, tell me about this science fair project you mentioned on the phone. His whole face brightened, and for 10 minutes I got to be just a grandfather again, listening to a 9-year-old explain, with tremendous seriousness, how he was going to build a model of a wind turbine. It was the best 10 minutes of the entire night. Then Nathan started fidgeting with the top button of his shirt, the collar clearly too tight for a boy who'd rather be in a t-shirt any day of the week. Mom, my collar's choking me. Mom? 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 He said, tugging at it. Leave it alone. Nathan, you look handsome, Renee said without looking up. But it really hurts. Grandpa, can you fix it? You always know how to fix things. I can fix his collar, no trouble at all, I said, already pushing back my chair. Dad, sit down, he's fine, Thomas muttered, not lifting his eyes from his plate. It's no trouble, Mike. I stood, walked the length of that ridiculous table, and knelt down beside my grandson. My fingers, thick and clumsy as they've become, worked the button loose and adjusted the collar until he could breathe easy. There you go, Sport. Sport. Thanks, Grandpa, he said, beaming up at me the way only a 9-year-old can. I straightened up to walk back to my seat, and that's when Patricia's voice cut through the room again, sharp as a struck match. Oh, Walter, since you're already up, she said, gesturing lazily at the stack of empty plates near the center of the table. Would you mind clearing those? I'm sure you're quite used to that sort of work. The room seemed to hold its breath. It was such a small sentence and such a large cruelty, designed for exactly one purpose, to remind me, in front of my grandchildren, in front of my own son, precisely where she believed I belonged. Not at the table. Beneath it, something in me, some long dormant wire that had finally had enough current run through it, simply refused to bend any further. No, I said, I won't be doing that. I'm a guest in my son's home tonight, same as you, and I intend to sit down and finish my dinner. You could have heard a pin drop on that hardwood floor. Patricia's face went through several shades of red. I didn't know a human face could produce. She was not a woman accustomed to being told no, not by anyone, and certainly not by a man she'd spent the entire evening trying to fold into a shape small enough to ignore. "Excuse me?" she said, rising from her chair so fast it screeched against the floor. "You want to sit? You want to be treated like family, is that it?" "I am family," I said quietly. "I'm his father." And she crossed the room in 4 quick strides, and before Thomas or Renee or anyone could so much as rise from their seats, she drew back her hand and struck me across the face. The sound of it cracked through that beautiful, expensive dining room like a rifle shot. My head snapped sideways. I tasted copper where my teeth had caught the inside of my cheek. For one long, ringing moment, I couldn't hear anything at all except the blood pounding in my own skull. "That," she hissed, looming over me, her chest heaving, "is for disrespecting my daughter's home. Men like you don't get a seat at tables like this. You get whatever scraps you're given and you say thank you." I looked up at my son. Blood was warm in my mouth. It's, 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 my cheek was already burning, already swelling. "Thomas," I said, my voice cracking despite everything I had to keep it steady. "Are you going to say anything?" Thomas's face had gone the color of old paper. His hands were flat on the table, pressing down like he needed the wood to keep him upright. For one flickering half-second, I saw something in his eyes, some ghost of the boy who used to run to me crying when the neighborhood kids were cruel to him, the boy I'd have walked through fire for. And then it was gone, smothered under 30 years of choosing the path of least resistance. "Dad," he said, and his voice came out small and pleading. Just apologize. Please, we can still salvage the evening." Something inside my chest didn't crack so much as simply shatter, all at once, cleanly, like a windshield taking a direct hit. "Apologize," I repeated. "She hit me, Thomas." 7. Your mother-in-law just struck your father across the face at your own dinner table. "I know, Dad, I know, but you did provoke her a little, you have to admit, and if you just say you're sorry, we can all sit back down and—" I honestly don't remember what he said after that. The words became a kind of static, a wall of noise that meant nothing. I looked at Renee, who was staring at her wine glass with an expression of pure, practiced neutrality, as though this happened at every family dinner and everyone had simply agreed not to mention it. Her cousin, seated further down, was smirking faintly, clearly entertained by the show. And Patricia stood there, arms folded, chin lifted, triumphant, as if she had just won something important. "Well?" Patricia said, tapping one manicured finger against her crossed arm. "Are we going to apologize? Or do I need to call someone about a trespasser in my daughter's home?" I stood there, cheek throbbing, and realized I had absolutely nowhere left to go. So, I couldn't strike a woman back. I couldn't say what I truly wanted to say in front of 2 children who deserved better than to watch their grandfather come apart at the seams. I opened my mouth, not entirely sure what was about to come out of it, when a small, clear voice sliced through the room like a blade through silk. "Mom." It was Nathan. He'd left his chair and was standing just a few feet from me, and in his small hands he was holding his phone, its screen glowing against his face. "Nathan, go back to your seat, this doesn't concern you," Renee said quickly, reaching for him. "But Mom." His voice was shaking, but it did not waver. "Something happened. I have to show you. We'll talk later, sweetheart," she said, still reaching. "No, Mom." He shouted it this time, loud enough that the whole room actually went silent. His eyes were wide, his small chest rising and falling fast. "I was Liv. On the app. The one Emma showed me how to use. It's been recording this whole time." The blood drained out of Renee's face so fast I thought she might faint right there at the table. Patricia's smug, triumphant expression cracked down the middle like a dropped plate. "What are you talking about?" Renee's voice climbed an octave. "It's Sir. Turn that off right now." But Nathan wasn't listening to her anymore. He turned the phone toward the room so we could all see the little red dot in the corner of the screen, the counter ticking upward, the number of people currently watching climbing even as we stared at it. Then he looked at me, his grandfather, the man who had just been humiliated and struck in front of him, and something in his young face hardened into a kind of resolve. I don't think I'd ever seen in a child that age. He turned back to the phone. Nana, he said, his voice trembling but clear, you're live right now. Everyone can see what you just did. A collective gasp rippled around that beautiful table. Patricia lunged toward him, hand outstretched, snarling something I won't repeat here, but Nathan was quick, ducking behind my legs the way he used to hide behind me as a toddler during thunderstorms. Patricia stopped short, her rage curdling instantly into something closer to panic as she realized, in real time, exactly what had just happened. The little red light blinked steadily on. The audio was crystal clear. Every insult about my shoes, every jab about my pension, the slap itself, the crack of it, my son telling his own father to apologize for being assaulted. All of it, streaming live to whoever happened to be watching. Nobody in that room moved. The only sound was the antique clock ticking somewhere behind me, counting off the seconds of what I already understood was the end of something. Renee finally broke the silence, her voice cracking down the middle. Nathan, who did you send that to? Nathan looked up at me first, like he needed to make sure I was all right before he answered anything else. Then he turned back to his mother, took a breath that shook his whole small frame, and asked the question that would echo in my ears for the rest of my life. Isn't it wrong to hit people? It's said. It's time. Nobody answered him. Nobody could. Nana hit Grandpa, he said, quieter now, like he was working something out loud that he still didn't fully understand. And nobody stopped her. Nobody said anything. I thought that's not what families do. He was right, and every single adult standing in that dining room knew it. They had all failed a test that a 9-year-old passed without even having to think about it. Thomas finally lifted his eyes from the table, and whatever composure he'd been clinging to fell away completely. Oh my God, he whispered, looking at me, then at the phone, then back at me. Dad, I'm so sorry. Renee had gone the color of the tablecloth. Patricia stood frozen with one hand pressed against her mouth, eyes darting around the room like she was searching for an exit that didn't exist. I didn't care, in that moment, about their panic. I knelt down beside Nathan and put both my scarred hands on his small shoulders. Buddy, I said, my voice thick, can I see the phone for a second? He handed it over without hesitation. The screen showed a stream of names scrolling past in the comments. Faster than I could read them, people I recognized and people I didn't. Patricia's country club friends, Renee's coworkers, neighbors, strangers, all of them watching in real time as the mask came off. I looked at Thomas. He was crying now, quiet and pathetic, his shoulders shaking. Dad, please, we can fix this. We can call and explain. We can say it got misunderstood. Please don't let this ruin everything. 1960. I stood back up slowly, feeling something settle over me that I can only describe as calm. The kind of calm you feel right after a lightning strike, when the air itself seems to go still. You know, I said, turning to Patricia, whose bravado had entirely evaporated, you told me men like me don't get a seat at tables like this. You were right. I don't belong here. I never did. I looked around the room, at the crystal, the mahogany, the expensive glazed carrots, going cold on porcelain plates. But watching this particular table's reputation come apart from the outside, I imagine that's going to be a fine view. I handed the phone back to Nathan. This, I told him, is the finest Christmas gift anybody has ever given me. You've got a good heart, sport. The best one at this whole table tonight. I turned toward the door. Thomas grabbed at my sleeve. Dad, please, don't leave like this, we can talk about it. You let her hit me, Thomas, I said, pulling my arm free, gentle but final. You told me to apologize to her. And your own father, bleeding at your dinner IDAPI, and your first instinct was to protect her feelings instead of mine. There's no fixing that tonight. Maybe not ever. You made a choice in that chair, son. You chose comfort. I hope it keeps you warm. I collected my coat from the hook by the door myself. Nobody offered to help. I walked out through that gleaming, sterile living room and into the cold December air. And as I made my way down the driveway, I could hear raised voices erupting behind me. Panicked and overlapping, the sound of a very expensive house finally coming apart at the seams. In the weeks that followed, that live stream did not disappear the way Thomas had hoped it would. It spread the way these things do now, shared and reshared, picked up by a local news outlet, then a bigger one. A wealthy widow striking an elderly retired lineman at his own son's Christmas dinner turned out to be exactly the kind of story people couldn't look away from. Patricia was quietly asked to step down from her position on the country club's charitable board. Renee's employer, who had apparently watched the clip along with several thousand other strangers, decided her judgment didn't align with the values printed on their company website, and she was let go within the month. The public, as they tend to do, chose a side, and for once in my life, that side was mine. Thomas called constantly at first, dozens of times a week, begging me to release some kind of statement calling it all a misunderstanding, worried sick about his business partners seeing the video, worried about the neighbors, worried about everything except, it seemed, the actual wound underneath it. I let every single call go to voicemail. I wasn't angry anymore, not exactly, and I think I'd simply run out of room to keep pretending an apology that only showed up after the whole world was watching meant anything at all. Months later, right around the time the first crocuses were pushing up through the last of the snow, a letter arrived in my mailbox. It was from Nathan, his handwriting still uneven and blocky the way a 9-year-old's is. Inside was a drawing, crayon, and colored pencil of the two of us fishing off the dock at the lake house Dorothy and I used to rent every summer. He wrote that he missed me. End quote. He wrote that he was sorry about how everything happened, though he had absolutely nothing to be sorry for. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he'd lost his phone privileges for half a year and that he didn't care one bit because he said he'd do the exact same thing again without even having to think about it. I keep that drawing on my refrigerator to this day, held up with a magnet shaped like a lightning bolt that Dorothy bought me as a joke 30 years ago. Some nights I look at it and I think about how strange it is that the person who finally taught this whole family what dignity actually looks like was 9 years old and barely came up to my elbow. The slap didn't break me. God knows it hurt, and God knows I'll remember the sound of it until the day I die. But it wasn't the pain of that hand across my face that stayed with me the longest. It was the silence that followed it, the silence of a grown son who couldn't find the courage to say a single word in my defense. And it was the sound of a small, clear voice, cutting straight through all of that silence, asking the only question that ever really mattered in that entire house. Sometimes the truth doesn't come from the person with the most to lose. Sometimes it comes from the one person in the room who never learned how to be anything other than honest. And thank God for that, because some nights, that's the only kind of justice a tired old man has left to hold on to.